Hey everyone! If you're new here, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more awesome stories just like this one. Also, let us know what you think in the comments below. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, let's dive into today's story. Maya Williams stood at the edge of the school's bus stop, her fingers gripping the straps of her backpack as she took in the towering building of Clearview High. The crisp autumn air wrapped around her, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass and the pavement still warm from the summer's heat. It was a typical school day, but it wasn't a typical day for her. She wasn't new to being the new girl, but there was something different about this school. Something about the stares she felt as soon as she stepped off the bus made her feel like the outsider she had spent so many years becoming. This was her fourth school in 3 years. She had learned how to blend in, how to keep her head down, to keep the conversation small and the attention smaller. She didn't need friends, didn't need to stand out. All she wanted was peace. Maya adjusted her bag and walked toward the school's main entrance, trying to ignore the whispers and the stares. But it was impossible to tune them out. The sound of her shoes on the pavement echoed through the morning air, and the distant laughter of students only reminded her of how disconnected she felt. The high school crowd moved in cliques, as they always did. The popular kids, the jocks, the cheerleaders, the band geeks, everyone had their place, and Maya wasn't sure where hers was yet. Her goal was simple: survive the day. Blend in. Avoid the drama. But then, she saw him. Bryce Carter stood in the hallway near the lockers, his confident smirk spreading across his face as he leaned against the wall. Tall, broad-shouldered, the captain of the football team, he was everything high school movies made him out to be. He exuded a sense of power that Maya had seen before, but not in a way she was willing to engage with. His friends laughed around him, hanging on to every word, feeding off his every move. It was a social magnetism she knew too well, the kind that only worked when people were either scared or impressed enough to follow. Maya didn't want to be part of that. She wasn't scared, but she wasn't interested in joining his fan club either. She wasn't here for drama. She wasn't here to be noticed. She adjusted her schedule and kept walking, hoping to blend in like she always did. But fate had other plans. As she walked past, someone bumped into her shoulder. The books in her hands scattered across the floor, tumbling out of her arms. "Oops, my bad," a voice called out, but it wasn't an accident. Maya's eyes dropped to the ground as she bent to pick up her books. She could already hear the snickers behind her, Bryce's voice cutting through the noise of the hallway. Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice smooth and almost predatory. Maya ignored him, keeping her head down, grabbing the last of her books. She wasn't going to engage. She had learned long ago that ignoring bullies was the best way to deal with them. But Bryce wasn't done. "New girl, huh?" he continued, his voice growing louder. "I haven't seen you around before. What's your name?" Maya didn't look up. She just grabbed the last of her books and stood, brushing past him without a word. She didn't have to say anything. She was used to being ignored. It was easier that way. But Bryce didn't like being ignored. "Hey!" His hand shot out, grabbing the strap of her backpack, pulling her back slightly. Maya froze. He was testing her. He wanted her to react. She didn't. Instead, she slowly turned around, meeting his eyes for the first time. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. There was something in her stare that made Bryce hesitate. The smile on his face faltered for a second, but he quickly recovered. "You think you're too good to talk to me, huh?" he mocked, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. Maya didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She just kept looking at him. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Bryce tilted his head, the smirk returning. "Oh, really? And why is that?" Maya didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of backing down. She just looked at him and said one simple thing. "Because you have no idea who I am." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Bryce standing there, unsure of what had just happened. He called after her again, but Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already won. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't even stepped out of her way. But in that moment, Maya had made Bryce realize something. He wasn't as in control as he thought he was. And that, more than anything, was just the beginning. The next few days at school felt strange for Maya. She was used to the whispers, the curious stares, the feeling of being on the outside looking in. But now, it was different. The eyes that followed her in the hallways were no longer filled with pity or curiosity. They were filled with something else, uncertainty, maybe even respect. She could sense the shift, but she didn't want to make too much of it. It wasn't about being noticed. It was about feeling at ease in her own skin, which was something she hadn't been able to do in a long time. Bryce, on the other hand, was different. She could feel the change in him from the moment she passed him in the hallway on the second day. Where he had once exuded confidence, he now seemed unsure of himself. He wasn't the same towering figure that commanded attention the way he had before. Now, he was smaller, more tentative. Every time she walked past him, she could sense the tension in his body, the way his eyes flickered nervously. It wasn't that he wasn't still trying to play the part of the school bully. It was just that now, it felt like his mask was cracking, revealing a side of him that no one had seen before. Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction as she walked by him, her head held high. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She hadn't screamed at him, hadn't thrown insults his way. She had simply stood her ground. And now, Bryce was the one stumbling. He was the one trying to get back the control he thought he had. By the time lunch arrived, Maya was already sitting in her usual spot at the far end of the cafeteria, the one she had claimed for herself in the days following her arrival. She didn't mind being alone. It wasn't that she didn't want to connect with anyone, it was that she was learning how to be content in her own company. Plus, it gave her time to observe, to watch the way people interacted with each other. And today, she couldn't help but watch Bryce. He was sitting with a few of his friends, but it wasn't the same. The laughter around the table was forced, the conversations awkward. Bryce's usual cocky grin was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a nervousness in his eyes, a hint of something Maya couldn't quite place. He was trying to hold on to his position, trying to act like he hadn't noticed how everything had started to shift. But Maya could see it. The power he once had was slipping away. As she ate, Maya overheard snippets of conversation from the table across the room. Some students were still talking about the scene in the hallway, the one where Bryce had tried to intimidate her, and how Maya had simply walked away. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they were thinking. The message was clear: Maya had done something Bryce wasn't used to. She hadn't been afraid. She hadn't given him the satisfaction of reacting. And it was making him look weaker, less in control. By the time the bell rang and the lunch period ended, Maya felt like she had accomplished something. She had kept her head down, stayed true to herself, and without lifting a finger, she had made a bigger impact than she had ever expected. But it wasn't over yet. That afternoon, as Maya walked to her next class, she saw Bryce again. This time, he was standing in the hallway, his back pressed against the lockers. His friends had scattered, leaving him alone, and for a moment, he looked like a stranger to Maya. He wasn't the confident, untouchable figure anymore. He was just a guy trying to keep up appearances, desperately trying to hold on to the remnants of his former self. Maya kept walking, her pace steady. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't even glance his way. She didn't need to. The power had shifted, and she knew it. Later that afternoon, after the final bell rang, Maya stepped out of the building and into the cool, late afternoon air. The tension of the day had faded, replaced by a strange sense of quiet relief. She didn't know how things would unfold with Bryce, but for now, she was content. She had proven something to herself: she could handle whatever came her way without losing control. Vin was waiting for her outside, leaning against his car, a half-smile on his face as she approached. "Well, how's the new world treating you?" he asked, his voice light and teasing. Maya didn't smile, but her eyes were calm. "It's fine," she said, her voice steady. But Bryce isn't done yet. He'll try something again. He won't give up that easily. Vin raised an eyebrow, pushing off the car to stand up straight. You ready for that? Maya nodded, her expression unchanging. He'll make a mistake. He's too proud not to. Vin chuckled softly. You're playing the long game, huh? Maya didn't answer right away. Instead, she slid into the passenger seat, her fingers tapping on the seat as the car pulled away. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew what she was doing. She was waiting for the right moment, and when it came, she would be ready. Bryce didn't stand a chance. By the middle of the week, Maya noticed something different in the hallways. The students no longer whispered behind her back, and Bryce no longer had that commanding presence. The whispers, once about her, were now about him. The king of the school was slowly being dethroned, and it wasn't just because of Maya's quiet defiance. It was because people had begun to see the cracks in his facade. Maya had been watching. Every day, she saw him walking through the halls, but this time, something was missing. The swagger, the arrogance, the power that came with being the school's top bully, they were all gone. Instead, he walked with his head down, shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had suddenly landed on him. And Maya knew, it wasn't just the school that was noticing. Bryce was beginning to feel it. At lunch, Maya sat in her usual spot, far from the chaos. Her space had become her sanctuary. It was the one place she could sit and observe without drawing attention to herself. Today, however, she couldn't help but watch Bryce. He was standing near the lunch line, talking with a few of his former teammates. But the usual jokes and loud laughter were absent. The conversations were quiet, awkward, and Bryce's friends no longer seemed to enjoy his company the way they used to. It was like the light around him had dimmed, and Maya felt a strange sense of satisfaction in watching it. But it wasn't because she wanted to see him suffer. It was because she knew she had done nothing to contribute to his fall. He had done it all on his own. His power, his reputation, it had all been built on fear, and once that fear started to crack, everything else followed. After lunch, Maya headed to her next class, but as she walked down the hallway, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Bryce was standing near the lockers again, his back to her. His posture was rigid, and his face was twisted with frustration. He was muttering to himself, clearly irritated by something, but Maya didn't need to hear his words to understand what was going on. He was trying to hold on to whatever power he thought he had left. But this time, it didn't bother Maya. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of anything he could throw her way. As she walked past him, she noticed how his eyes followed her, but this time, there was no challenge, no taunt in his gaze. It was just uncertainty. He didn't know what to do with her anymore. And that, more than anything, was what had started to eat away at his confidence. Maya didn't break her stride as she walked past. She didn't glance back. There was no need to. She had already proven that she wasn't scared of him. She didn't need to acknowledge him for him to know that. Later that day, as Maya was getting ready to leave school, she saw Vin waiting for her outside in his car. As she climbed into the passenger seat, she noticed the same steady look in his eyes that had been there since the first day they met. "You look different," he said as he shifted the car into gear and started driving. "You're not the same girl who first walked into that school." Maya glanced out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. "I've changed," she said simply, her voice steady. "But Bryce has too. And he's not going to stop until he's lost everything." Vin's gaze flickered to her, but he didn't say anything right away. They both knew the situation wasn't over. Bryce wouldn't give up. He never did. But that wasn't Maya's problem. She had done what she needed to do. She had put the ball in his court, and now, it was his turn to make the next move. "Don't worry," Vin said, breaking the silence. "He's already made his mistake. It's just a matter of time before the rest of the school sees it." Maya nodded but didn't reply. She didn't need to. The waiting was the hardest part, but she was patient. She knew that when the time was right, the final piece would fall into place. That evening, as she sat in her room, Maya let herself relax for the first time in days. She wasn't worried about what Bryce would do next. She was confident in her ability to handle whatever came her way. She had made it this far by staying calm, by keeping her head straight, and by not letting her emotions take control. And that, she realized, was the key to everything. Bryce had tried to play the game by his rules, but Maya had been playing her own. She didn't need to win with force. She didn't need to fight with words. She just needed to let him make the mistake. And as long as she stayed patient, he would. Maya leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting. She knew what Bryce's next move would be. And when it came, she would be ready. Because this time, she wasn't going to let him make her feel small. The following days seemed to drag on for Maya, but in a strange way, that was exactly what she needed. The atmosphere at school was different now, not just for her, but for everyone. The whispers had evolved from curiosity to speculation. People were starting to talk about Bryce, and not in the way they used to. They weren't fascinated by his power anymore. They were starting to realize that his confidence was built on a lie. Maya didn't mind the attention. She didn't want to be the center of it, but she had long since stopped hiding in the background. She had spent years feeling invisible, but now she was starting to feel like she had a place, just not the one people had expected for her. She watched Bryce, more intently than ever. He no longer owned the hallways. He walked through the school like a shadow of himself, shoulders slumped, his eyes flickering nervously whenever anyone made eye contact with him. The students who once followed him now avoided him, unsure whether they should stay loyal or distance themselves. Maya had noticed that even the football team was starting to fragment, as if the core of their unity was beginning to crack. She had known that Bryce wouldn't go down without a fight. He was stubborn, too proud to let it all slip away without a final attempt to regain control. But Maya was patient. She knew what was coming. That afternoon, as she made her way through the hallways, she saw him again. Bryce was standing near the lockers, talking in low, hurried tones to a few of his remaining friends. His back was to her, but even from a distance, Maya could see how he was trying to project an image of power, leaning casually against the lockers as though he wasn't struggling. But his body language betrayed him. His hands were twitching at his sides, and his eyes kept darting around, searching for an escape. Maya didn't break her stride. She simply walked past him, her pace deliberate and calm. But she knew Bryce was watching her. She could feel it. She didn't need to turn around to know he was sizing her up, trying to figure out what she was doing. But Maya wasn't doing anything. She wasn't reacting, wasn't giving him anything. And that was the hardest part for him. He needed her to react. He needed her to be afraid, to get mad, to challenge him in some way. But she wasn't playing his game anymore. She had already won. Later that afternoon, after the bell rang, Maya found herself alone in the hallway once more. The school was mostly empty now, with the students trickling out to go home. She had gotten into the habit of staying behind, taking a moment to herself before heading out to the bus stop. But today, something was different. She had noticed Bryce lingering near the exit, waiting for her. He was standing alone, his hands shoved into his pockets, his jaw tight with something that wasn't quite anger, but was close enough to it. Maya paused for a moment. She could have walked away. She could have ignored him again, the way she had in the past. But she didn't. This time, it was different. She took a deep breath, her mind calm, and walked straight toward him. "Bryce," she said, her voice steady. "You really thought you could keep control forever, didn't you?" He looked up, his eyes flickering with a mix of irritation and something else. Desperation, maybe. "What do you want, Maya?" His voice was low, almost a growl. But there was something in it that told her he wasn't angry, he was scared. He was beginning to see what everyone else already had. "I want you to stop," she said, her voice quieter now. "I want you to stop pretending like this is still your school. It's not. You're not in control anymore." Bryce's eyes darkened, and he took a step toward her. You think you can just come in here and change everything? His voice was shaky, but he was trying to sound tough. Trying to hold on to whatever dignity he had left. Maya didn't back away. I didn't change anything. You did. You spent all this time building up your power on fear and intimidation, and now that it's starting to crumble, you don't know what to do. Bryce's hands clenched into fists. You don't know anything about me, he spat, his face twisted in frustration. Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. I know enough. You're scared of losing everything you've worked so hard to build. But you don't realize, everything you built was based on a lie. And the second people stop fearing you, it all falls apart. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Bryce's expression was unreadable, his fists still clenched. But Maya saw it. The doubt in his eyes. The realization that she was right. You're not the person you think you are, Bryce, she continued, her voice steady. You've been using fear to control everyone around you, but that doesn't last. People are starting to see who you really are. And when they do, it won't matter how many friends you have left. It won't matter how many games you play. You're just not that powerful anymore. She turned to leave, but just before she did, she heard his voice again. This time, it wasn't with anger. It was different. Why are you doing this, Maya? He asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Maya paused for a moment, her back still to him. Because you're the one who made the game. I'm just waiting for you to finish it. With that, she walked away. Bryce didn't say anything else. But she knew he wouldn't stop trying. He couldn't help it. He had built his whole world on the belief that fear could control others. But now, he was starting to see the truth, fear wasn't power. It was weakness. And his time was running out. The days that followed felt like a waiting game, a tense stillness that hung over the school. Maya noticed it more as time went on. People were watching Bryce. They were no longer paying attention to her, not like they had in the past. The whispers had stopped, and the curious stares were no longer directed her way. Instead, Bryce was the one under the microscope. It was as if everyone had finally realized what Maya had known all along. The boy who had once ruled the school with arrogance and intimidation was no longer in control. Maya continued to walk through the hallways with her head held high, her pace steady. She didn't need to look over her shoulder anymore, didn't need to wonder if Bryce was going to try something again. He wasn't. Not really. His attempts to provoke her had dwindled, and now there was a different kind of silence between them. It wasn't comfortable, though. It was uncomfortable for him. The confidence he once wore so easily had cracked, and the mask he had used to hide his insecurities was starting to show its cracks. In class, Maya didn't pay Bryce any mind. He was still there, of course, sitting at the back of the room with his friends, but the energy had shifted. His friends didn't laugh as loud at his jokes anymore. They didn't hang on to his every word. It was as if they were slowly realizing that the same guy they had once feared and admired wasn't as invincible as they had thought. The laughter was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence whenever Bryce spoke. His attempts to reassert his power fell flat. Lunch came, and as always, Maya sat by herself. But today, it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like peace. The noise of the cafeteria, the laughter, the chatter, none of it reached her. Her space had become just that, hers. She didn't need to be part of the chaos, part of the cliques, or the drama. She had a quiet strength now, something she hadn't realized she'd always had until this moment. From across the room, she saw Bryce again, but this time, he was different. He wasn't sitting with his usual group. Instead, he was sitting at the far edge of the cafeteria, his eyes scanning the room nervously. His posture was rigid, like he was trying to pretend he didn't care, but Maya saw it. His eyes flicked back and forth, searching for someone who might acknowledge him. His friends had dispersed, leaving him alone. For the first time in a long while, Maya felt a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was more like a realization. Bryce had built his world on fear, on his ability to control others with his presence. But now, that control was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do about it. She finished her lunch slowly, watching as Bryce's attempts to regain his status became more desperate. He was trying, she could see that. But it wasn't working. And Maya knew, deep down, he could feel it. He knew it, too. After lunch, as Maya made her way to her next class, she passed him again. This time, their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. Not anger. Not even fear. Just understanding. Bryce knew. He knew he had lost. But that wasn't the end of it. That afternoon, as the final bell rang and the school began to empty, Maya walked out into the parking lot. She had her routine, catch the bus, head home, and enjoy the quiet of her evening. But today, something felt different. She saw Bryce standing by his car, watching her from a distance. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't trying to make a show of it. He was just standing there, still, as if he was waiting for something. Maya didn't stop. She kept walking, her eyes focused ahead, but she could feel him watching her. He wanted something from her. A reaction. A sign of weakness. But Maya wasn't going to give it to him. Not anymore. When she reached the bus, she looked back. Bryce was still standing there, his eyes fixed on her. But there was no challenge in his gaze anymore. There was nothing left to prove. He had already lost, and he knew it. Later that night, Maya sat in her room, her thoughts drifting back to the day's events. She didn't feel victorious in the way she had expected. It wasn't about being right or winning. It was about control, the control she had over herself, over her emotions, and her ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. And as she thought about Bryce, she realized something. She hadn't won because she had outsmarted him or made him back down. She had won because she had refused to play by his rules. She had refused to let fear dictate her actions. She had let him dig his own grave, and he had done it without even realizing it. As the days passed, Maya felt like she was in the eye of a storm. Everything around her was shifting, but she remained still, calm, and patient. The school had changed in subtle ways, and Bryce, for all his bluster, was becoming a shadow of his former self. The social hierarchy that had once been so rigid, so clearly defined by fear and popularity, was beginning to crack. Students had started to question Bryce's power, and Maya was starting to see the consequences of her patience. She hadn't needed to shout. She hadn't needed to challenge him directly. All she had done was let him unravel. And he was doing it all on his own. It wasn't that Bryce had given up yet, but it was clear to Maya that his grip was slipping. He still tried to hold on to the scraps of his reputation, still tried to force his way into conversations he once dominated, but now it felt forced. The students who once laughed too loudly at his jokes or followed his lead were now hesitant. They weren't sure if they should still be loyal to the king of the school, or if they should back away before they got caught up in his downfall. Maya wasn't sure how long Bryce could keep up the act. He was starting to look more and more like a person desperately trying to keep his place in the world, but it wasn't working. The facade he had so carefully crafted was crumbling, and soon, everyone would see him for who he really was, a bully with nothing left to hold on to. It was during lunch one day that Maya saw him again, standing in the same spot as always, near the center of the cafeteria, surrounded by the remnants of his former followers. But today, it was different. There was no laughter. There were no smiles or jokes. Just silence. Bryce's posture was rigid, his eyes darting from face to face, as if waiting for someone to take charge, but no one did. Maya watched from her usual seat at the far end of the cafeteria, her gaze steady. She wasn't surprised by what she saw, but it was hard to ignore the change in him. The school had stopped looking at him with the same awe and fear they had just weeks ago. It was like watching a star dim from the center of the universe until it was no more than a flickering light in the distance. She noticed one of his old friends, Ryan, the linebacker, looking at Bryce, then looking away. He didn't join him at his table. He didn't even meet his eyes. Bryce was isolated. And for the first time, Maya felt no anger or desire for revenge. she felt something else, a sense of quiet satisfaction. She didn't need to fight back. She didn't need to confront him. She just needed to stay the course, and Bryce would do the rest. After lunch, Maya made her way to the library for her study period. It was always quieter there, and she used the time to focus on her own thoughts, her own goals. The library was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape from the noise of the school and really think about what she was doing. It wasn't just about dealing with Bryce anymore. It was about understanding herself. It was about finding her strength and realizing that she didn't need anyone's validation to be who she was. But that afternoon, as she sat at a table by the window, she noticed something unusual. Bryce walked past the library, and for the first time, he didn't walk with that confident stride. His head was down, his shoulders slumped. He didn't stop to talk to anyone. He didn't try to make eye contact. He was walking as if he was trying to disappear. Maya watched him from the corner of her eye, feeling a strange kind of relief. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. Bryce was breaking down. He was losing the power he had held over everyone, and now, it was only a matter of time before the last of his supporters would slip away. Later that evening, Maya sat at the kitchen table at home, her mind replaying the day's events. She didn't feel like celebrating. She didn't feel victorious. She simply felt calm. The victory hadn't come in the way she had expected. She hadn't been the one to defeat Bryce in a public showdown. Instead, she had watched him destroy himself. And that, more than anything, felt like the sweetest kind of revenge. Vin came into the kitchen, his casual footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her as she stared out the window, lost in thought. "You know, you've got this whole thing figured out," he said, his voice calm but impressed. "You've played him without even touching him." Maya didn't answer right away. She took a slow breath, letting the weight of the past few weeks settle into her. It wasn't about beating him, Vin. It was about letting him lose. He was already lost before I ever walked into that school. Vin nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, I think you're right. He just didn't know it yet." Maya's eyes shifted to the street outside, watching the last light of the day fade into twilight. "He'll figure it out soon enough," she said softly. "And when he does, I'll be long gone." By the start of the next week, things at school had shifted yet again. The usual chaos of the hallways seemed quieter, more subdued. It wasn't just because it was Monday morning, it was because Bryce's reign was clearly over. His fall from grace had become the subject of every conversation, and Maya couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the way people interacted with him. The whispers and rumors that had once surrounded him like a shield now turned into stares of judgment and pity. At lunch, Maya sat alone as usual, but today, there was no loneliness in it. The silence felt peaceful, not isolating. She watched the students around her, their eyes darting to Bryce, who had once commanded every corner of the cafeteria. Today, he sat at a table alone, his shoulders slumped, his usual arrogance replaced with something far less confident, vulnerability. He wasn't the powerful figure he had been only a week ago. The mask had cracked, and now, the truth was all too clear to everyone who had ever followed him. Maya didn't feel triumphant. She wasn't looking for Bryce's humiliation, but she couldn't ignore the satisfaction that came with seeing him struggle. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about knowing that the power he had used to manipulate people had been nothing more than a facade. His ability to control others had crumbled, and all it took was Maya's refusal to play by his rules. She had stayed quiet, stayed composed, and in doing so, she had shifted the dynamic entirely. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and as Maya made her way to her next class, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Bryce wasn't walking with his usual swagger. He wasn't leaning against lockers with a confident grin on his face. Instead, he was hunched over, his eyes scanning the floor, avoiding the gazes of the people around him. The weight of his defeat was written all over his posture. He had always been the one to make others feel small, to make them look up to him, but now, it was clear that he was the one who felt small. Maya didn't stop to look at him, didn't slow her pace as she passed. She didn't need to. She had already done what she needed to do. It wasn't her responsibility to fix him, to make him realize his mistakes. He would have to come to that conclusion on his own, and Maya knew that would take time. Later that day, as the final bell rang and students poured out of the building, Maya felt the familiar sense of quiet confidence that had been growing in her over the past few weeks. She had spent so long trying to fit in, trying to make herself invisible. But now, she didn't need to do that anymore. She had found her place, not by conforming, but by standing firm in her own strength. As she walked toward the bus, she saw him again. Bryce was standing by the parking lot, his car in the distance, but he wasn't in a hurry to leave. His face was drawn, his gaze distant as he stared out at the world around him, as if trying to figure out where he went wrong. Maya didn't look away. She didn't feel anger or triumph or even pity. She just felt quiet. She had done what she needed to do, had remained calm, stayed in control, and it had worked. Bryce had dug his own grave, and she had let him. There was nothing more to prove. She kept walking, her steps steady as she approached the bus, her mind clear. There was no more drama, no more power struggle. Maya had outlasted it all, and in the end, it had cost Bryce everything he had fought to maintain. It wasn't a win she had to shout about. It was a quiet victory. The kind that felt real. Vin was already waiting in the car, leaning against it with his arms crossed, a smirk on his face as she approached. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," he teased, his tone light. "How's it feel to see Bryce finally crumble?" Maya slid into the passenger seat, her gaze focused out the window. "I didn't do anything, Vin," she said quietly. "I just let him be himself. He did the rest." Vin chuckled softly, starting the car. "You make it sound so simple." Maya smiled faintly. "It was." She let out a breath, feeling the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The game had ended, and Bryce had lost. Not because Maya had fought him, but because she had refused to play by his rules. And now, she was free. The days after Bryce's downfall felt different for Maya. The weight of tension that had been hanging in the air for weeks was finally gone. The students who had once watched every move Bryce made were now walking past him without a second glance. He was a shadow now, a reminder of what had once been, but no longer held the power he once did. Maya noticed the change in him the most in the hallways. His usual confident stride was replaced by a hunched, defeated walk. He no longer tried to command attention when he entered a room. Instead, he tried to blend in, to become invisible, just like the way Maya had been forced to do when she first arrived at Clearview. The power he had wielded so easily had crumbled, and now, the students were moving on. It wasn't that Maya wanted to see him suffer. She had never wanted that. But it was hard to ignore the satisfaction of knowing that Bryce had done all of this to himself. He had pushed people away, used fear to control them, and when it all unraveled, it was because of his own arrogance. Maya sat in the same spot at lunch every day. Alone, but not lonely. She had grown used to it. This was her space, and no one could take that from her. She had come to understand that she didn't need the validation of others. She didn't need to be accepted by the people who once seemed so important. What mattered was that she had control over herself, and no one could take that away. But today, as she ate, she couldn't help but notice Bryce again. He was sitting at the far end of the cafeteria, at a table alone. There were no jocks laughing at his jokes, no cheerleaders hanging onto his every word. He was isolated, the way Maya had once been, and it was all of his own making. Maya didn't feel sorry for him. She didn't feel sympathy. She just felt indifferent. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. Later that afternoon, Maya saw him once more. This time, he was standing near the lockers, looking lost. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't trying to make his usual jokes. He just stood there, staring at the floor, his expression unreadable. Maya had never seen him so small. It was strange, seeing him like that, but in a way, it felt like the final chapter was being written. Bryce didn't look up when Maya passed by. She didn't expect him to. He was already aware that he had lost. He had already acknowledged that he was no longer the powerful figure he had once been. But the question still lingered in her mind: how long would it take for him to fully accept it? That night, when Maya was home, she couldn't shake the thought of Bryce. She had done what she set out to do. She had made him realize that power built on fear was hollow, that it could only last for so long. But the question still sat there, unanswered. What would Bryce do next? Would he try to fight back? Or would he finally accept that his reign was over? Vin was there, sitting in the living room, his feet propped up on the coffee table. He had been watching the same sports highlights for the past hour, but Maya knew he wasn't really paying attention. He was more tuned into her thoughts than anything else. Still thinking about him, huh? He asked, his voice casual but knowing. Maya looked at him, not surprised that he could tell. I just want him to make the right choice. But I don't think he will. Vin raised an eyebrow, then smiled. You think he'll try to come back? I think he'll try, Maya said slowly. But I don't think he knows how to come back from this. She sat on the couch across from him, her thoughts turning over in her mind. She had spent so much time thinking about Bryce's power, his arrogance, the way he used fear to control everyone. And now, she realized, she had done what she needed to do. She had let him fall. She had let him make the mistake of thinking he could intimidate her, of thinking he could control her. And now, she had no more room for that kind of thinking. I think you're right, Vin said, his tone soft. But the real question is, what are you going to do now? Maya thought for a moment, her eyes focused on the window. The night outside was calm, peaceful, the soft light of the street lamps filtering through the curtains. For the first time, she felt at ease. Not because Bryce had lost, but because she had learned to trust herself. I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing, Maya said quietly. I'm going to stay true to myself. I'm going to keep walking my path. Because that's the only thing that matters. Vin smiled, nodding in approval. You've got this. You've already won. Maya leaned back, letting the weight of the past few weeks settle into her bones. She had played the long game, and she had come out on top. It hadn't been through force, or violence, or aggression. It had been through patience, through restraint, through the quiet strength of not needing to prove herself to anyone. And as she sat there, she knew that Bryce's time was running out. He could try to hold on to his power for a little while longer, but he would eventually realize that fear wasn't enough to keep control. His world was falling apart, and all Maya had to do was wait for the final pieces to fall. The final stretch of the school year seemed to pass in a blur for Maya. The drama had finally settled, but the silence left in the wake of it was almost deafening. The atmosphere around her was different now, not just from the way people looked at her, but from the way they now looked at Bryce. His fall from the top wasn't just a matter of reputation anymore, it had become a lesson. Maya had known that there would be no grand confrontation, no climactic battle where she would come out victorious. No, the victory had already happened. It had happened quietly, slowly, and in a way that only Maya could fully understand. She had turned the tables not with force, but with patience, letting Bryce's own arrogance and fear unravel on their own. She noticed that students no longer made room for him in the hallways. The groups that once gravitated toward him had begun to form new alliances, ones that didn't involve Bryce. Maya saw Ryan, his former friend and linebacker, now walking with other students, not even sparing a glance for Bryce. The social structure had shifted, and Maya knew it wasn't just about her. It was about the truth. People had seen Bryce for who he really was, a person who used fear to control others, but who could no longer hide behind that fear once it had been exposed. One afternoon, as Maya was walking to her locker, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Bryce was standing near the lockers, once again alone. This time, though, his posture wasn't rigid. He wasn't trying to look tough, and he wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. His body language was different, slumped, like he had given up. His face was tired, drawn, and his eyes were locked on the floor. He wasn't even trying to make eye contact with anyone anymore. Maya paused for a moment, considering whether she should approach him. But then she realized there was nothing left to say. Bryce had already made his mistakes. He had already shown everyone who he really was. Maya had no desire to rub it in. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to confront him. Bryce's downfall was self-inflicted. She had simply let him get there on his own. As Maya turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of his expression, empty, lost, and full of regret. She wasn't sure if he was regretful because he realized his mistakes, or because he was too proud to admit them. Either way, it didn't matter. Maya had moved on, and it was clear that Bryce hadn't yet figured out how to. The next day, as Maya sat in the library during her free period, she found herself thinking back to everything that had led up to this moment. She had come to this school with no expectations, just the hope that she could get through it without making waves. But what had happened? Bryce had tried to break her, tried to make her afraid. And in the end, it was Bryce who had broken himself. Her phone buzzed on the table, and Maya glanced down to see a message from Vin. "You're still good, right? He's not going to try anything else, is he?" Maya smiled faintly, typing her response quickly. "No. He's done. It's over. I've let him make his move. Now it's his turn to deal with the fallout." Vin replied almost immediately. "Good. I knew you had this. You've got this, Maya. You always did." Maya set the phone down, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. It was finally over. There was no more waiting, no more wondering if Bryce would come back for one last confrontation. She had done what she needed to do. She had outlasted him, and now, the school had seen the truth. That afternoon, as she walked out to the bus, she saw him one last time. Bryce was standing near the parking lot, but this time, he wasn't alone. He was talking to someone, Ryan, the linebacker who had once been his closest friend. Ryan's face was stern, but Maya could see it. There was no respect in the way Bryce carried himself anymore. He had nothing left to offer. No one was looking up to him. No one was afraid of him anymore. Bryce looked up briefly as she walked by, but he didn't say anything. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and there was no sneer this time. No challenge. Just resignation. Maya kept walking, not slowing down. There was nothing more to say, and in that moment, she realized that she didn't need to say anything. Bryce's power had already crumbled. He had already lost. Later that evening, as Maya sat on her bed, looking out the window at the stars, she realized something important. This was the beginning of something new. Not just for her, but for everyone around her. Bryce had been a symbol of everything she had once feared. But now, he was a lesson. A lesson in what happens when someone tries to control others through fear, through manipulation. And Maya had proven that she didn't need to play that game. She had chosen her own path, and it had led her here. There was no victory dance. No loud declaration of her success. But there was peace. And that was enough. The days had started to blur together for Maya, but in a way, that was exactly what she needed. After all the chaos, after the tension and the constant feeling of being watched, the quiet had finally settled in. The drama at school had subsided. Bryce had finally accepted what everyone else already knew, that his reign was over. Maya walked through the hallways with a sense of ease now. There was no more need to dodge glances or avoid confrontation. The students had stopped whispering behind her back. Instead, they smiled when they passed her, nodded in quiet recognition. They didn't see her as the quiet new girl anymore. She wasn't an outsider. She was Maya. Bryce, on the other hand, was still trying to keep up appearances. He would stand at the lockers, pretending to talk to his old friends, but no one took him seriously anymore. The jocks who had once hung on his every word had started to distance themselves. Ryan, who had been his closest ally, no longer bothered to sit with him at lunch. The cracks in his confidence were too wide to hide. Bryce was falling apart, and everyone could see it. Maya wasn't concerned with him anymore. She had done what she came to do. She had outlasted him, let him expose his own weaknesses, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about seeing him fail. It was about taking control of her own life and not letting anyone push her around. That afternoon, as she sat in the library once again, her eyes flicked over to the entrance. Bryce had walked in, his head down, shoulders slumped. For the first time in a while, Maya actually felt a twinge of something, a brief moment of sympathy, perhaps. But that was all. He had done this to himself. She returned her focus to the textbook in front of her, unwilling to engage in any more of his drama. There was no need. He was already a shadow of his former self, and he wasn't coming back from it. Later, when the final bell rang, signaling the end of another school day, Maya packed her things and headed toward the exit. She had grown used to the routine, used to walking through the halls without feeling the weight of Bryce's power hanging over her. As she reached the doors, she caught sight of him one last time. Bryce was standing outside, his car parked across the lot, but he wasn't trying to act like the king anymore. His shoulders were slouched, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Maya had never seen before. He was just tired. Tired of fighting a battle that had already been lost. As she walked toward the bus, Bryce didn't try to stop her. He didn't call out to her. He didn't do anything. And for the first time, Maya realized something: he was no longer in control. She was. And that was enough. The bus ride home was quiet. Maya sat by the window, staring out at the passing streets, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't because Bryce had been defeated. It wasn't because she had won a battle. It was because she had found peace. When she got home, she walked into the kitchen, where Vin was sitting with a mug of coffee, his feet up on the counter. "Looks like everything's finally quiet now," he said, glancing up at her with a smile. "How does it feel?" Maya took a deep breath, leaning against the counter. "It feels different. It's not the victory I thought it would be. I didn't have to fight for it. I just let him fall apart." Vin nodded, understanding. "You didn't need to prove anything. You already knew that." Maya smiled, grateful for the quiet support. "Yeah. I just had to be patient. Let him make the mistakes on his own." Vin raised his mug in a mock toast. "You've got it figured out, kid." Maya took a seat at the table, her fingers tapping lightly on the surface. "I don't know what comes next," she said, looking out the window. "But I know I'm ready. I'm done letting anyone control me. Not Bryce, not anyone. I'm in control of my own life now." Vin didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just sat there, a small smile on his face, knowing that Maya had already figured it out. She had faced down the person who had once intimidated her, and now, she had come out on the other side stronger than ever. As the evening wore on, Maya felt the weight of everything that had happened lift from her shoulders. She had already won, not because of some dramatic showdown, but because she had stood her ground. Because she had found her own strength and let others see it. And as she sat in the calm of the moment, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The world was wide open for her, and she was finally free to take it on. And that's it, folks, the end of Maya's journey. What an amazing ride it's been. If you've loved this story, make sure you like and subscribe so you can catch all the future stories. What do you think Maya's next move will be? Leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. Thanks for following along, and we'll see you in the next one.